You just push here,
and the mic works. Prova. 1, 2, 3, 4, prova.
Check, sì. Sentite? Senti?
Sì, ma va in conflitto con cosa?
Adesso va in Larsen, perché i microfoni sono diretti. Sì, check, sì. Sì, allora, questa è una possibilità. Ok. Vogliamo provare, però... acceso.
Bene,
Prova.
test. Sì, sento.
Okay, check, check. Hello. Is this supposed to be working? Are they hearing me? Just too quiet.
He's just there, shutting.
It's not working?
Try one of those. Put it on. Push.
Check. Good morning.
We are about to start, please. Yeah, just speak loud.
Oh, it's just on. Okay, good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me? The mic's loud enough? Yes, okay. Well, it's just loud in the room, I guess. Yeah, so good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the Finetti lecture. The lecture recognizes outstanding scholars who've made significant contributions to the field of Bayesian statistics. It was also created to honor Bruno De Finetti's influential work, and this is, of course, a fitting place to have such a lecture, given that De Finetti worked in Padua and Trieste not too far from here before he moved to Rome. Before we start the lecture, I wanted to take a moment to thank the other members of the Committee on Named Lectures for putting this together, and also a very big thank you to David Dunson and David Dunson and Chris Holmes, who've agreed to give discussions for this later this session. Now I'm very excited to introduce Michael Jordan, who has been selected as the De Finetti lecturer this year. He is the Pehong Chen Distinguished Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and the Department of Statistics at UC Berkeley. He's also a researcher at INRA in Paris. His research focuses on the relationships between computation, statistics, and economics. He has many honors that he's received. I will just very briefly mention a few of them. He's a member of the National Academy of Science and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He is also a fellow of a very large number of societies, including ISBA. Last I checked, he had almost 300,000 citations on Google Scholar, which I found very impressive. And a couple of years ago, he was also named the most influential computer scientist in an article in Science, where he's also called the Michael Jordan of machine learning. Today, he's going to tell us about uncertainty, asymmetry of information, and statistical contract theory. So everyone, please welcome Michael Jordan to the stage.
Thank you. It's absolutely a delight to be here. See so many old friends. And let me thank ISBA for inviting me for the De Finetti lecture. When I first was a professor many years ago, I didn't know much probability and I didn't know how to speak Italian, and those were two things I wanted to rectify. So I like to be efficient, and I decided to do them together. So I read De Finetti's probability book in Italian, and so I learned both Italian and probability. I went and returned to it many times over the years, and that's a true story. So there are a couple of words on my slide there that may not be all that familiar, and the goal of the talk is partly to make you familiar with them, but also believe that this is part of not only the past, but the future of Bayesian statistics. De Finetti himself was in fact quite broad. There's a nice picture of Bruno as a young man. Looks like the kind of person you'd want to have dinner with. He's known mostly for his work in prediction exchangeability. And you might be forgiven to think that's kind of all he did. That's what he wrote about mostly. But he was also an actuary. He worked in the insurance business in Trieste. And he wrote about many things. So you can certainly find work or elements of his papers that talk about risk and actuarial ideas, insurance. He even had papers on demographics that had kind of a phylogenetic flavor to them. But also you can see quite explicitly talk about games and markets and collectives and economic ideas. So that's going to be what my talk's about. It's about economics, really, and bringing economics more closely together with statistics. The relationship has been on and off over the years. Also, I want to note that De Finetti wrote many interesting papers that had computer science flavor to them. So I just saw one last night that I had never seen before, but it's called Macchine che pensano che fanno pensare, machines that think and make you think. And this was around 1950, and so Turing had been talking, and cybernetics was in the vogue. And so he looked at all those issues, and he had a paper with like pictures of computers and circuits and all that. That's De Finetti. I also, one further connection, which is that I now live half of the year in Trieste. I knew this would happen. And there's a video that you can find of me walking around Trieste giving something like this talk in a more congenial atmosphere and congenial style. So if you want to look at that, I think that's a better presentation than one you're about ready to see. Okay, so Bruno De Finetti had a long career, and starting mostly in Trieste, where he wrote lots of academic papers while working in the insurance business. And he was very much aware of the trends of the time. So cybernetics was Norbert Wiener's thing. He allied himself with cybernetics. Cybernetics, was this broad framework coming from a mathematician, but having a grand scope to it. It gave rise certainly to control theory, but there was a lot of computer science in there as well. John McCarthy had a very different point of view, and the two of them argued quite a bit. Wiener was a mathematician and had lots of continuous mathematics. McCarthy was a logician and had no continuous mathematics. Basically, Wiener's ideas have won out. The things that we see in technology today are very much a la cybernetics and very much not a la John McCarthy, but the terminology of McCarthy won out, which is very, very strange and sad in my view. In the meantime, it's also worth noting that what computers got used for was not to be, creating intelligence and not really cybernetics in exactly Wiener's vision, but this other vision, which is often called intelligence augmentation. That's due to a third person, Douglas Engelbart, who also argued with the two of the other gentlemen on the page there. He felt that computers themselves shouldn't be intelligent, they should augment human intelligence. And that's arguably what's happened. The search engine, the internet and all, is it not itself intelligent per se? It indexes web pages and so on, but it augments all of our own intelligence to cooperate with each other, to learn things, to have information at our fingertips. All right, now on the other hand, those are academic perspectives, and we have a tendency to believe that academic perspectives is what drive everything, and that's rarely the case. So this phrase machine learning started to get used much later. It really has a cybernetics flavor. I don't think of it as a new field at all. It's really kind of statistics with a big helping hand from computer science. I do find it funny when people give that quote about me being the most influential computer science. I'm not a computer science. I'm really a statistician. I never was a computer science. I don't know much computer science. But I eventually had to adopt this terminology of machine learning. And people would say, what is it? I'd say it's just statistics. And they'd say, oh, come on. But then I realized what it is, it's kind of real world statistics in the information technology sphere. It's an engineering problem solving activity, if you will. And this is, I don't want to go through this slide in length here, but this is what I think really happened over the last 40 years. Starting in companies like Amazon, Alibaba, in the back end of the company, you had to build supply chains at massive scale that we've never seen before in history. 1 billion products goes out to hundreds of millions of customers at Amazon every day. Each product is assembled from parts all around the world and brought all around the world. It's a stochastic control system, the world's largest ever conceived of. It could not be done by humans writing down equations. It could not be done with textbook ideas. So how was it done? It was done with statistics. It was done with machine learning. In fact, random forest, which were the neural networks of the day, circa 2000, Leo Bryman. To do that, they had so much data about all these supply chains, all the ships, all the trains, all the schedules and all that they couldn't run that on a single computer. They couldn't even run on 10, they had to run it on thousands. And so they stitched together tens to thousands of computers eventually, and they ran these random forests on these massive data sets. That was the beginnings of the cloud. That literally is how the cloud began. Running random forests on supply chain data at Amazon, literally, okay? You ask why Amazon got ahead in the cloud business, that's why, all right? Now those solutions that system came up with, it was a system, were really interesting. I went down there in 2000 and I talked to the supply chain experts and they said, wow, we've never seen in our textbooks, we don't see these kind of solutions. It's very creative, it being this system, all right? It sounds very much like our current AI era. Or in fact, I think we got there very not that much change. So the second generation was that Amazon and other companies realized they didn't just have supply chain data in the back end, they had data about human transactions. So humans now come into the picture, and with human transactions, you can predict other things, what someone's likely to buy next, and what needs to be brought to that person's door and how to do it. So now you get a blending of the back end and the human side, and that became recommendation systems and led to billions of dollars of productivity gains. Very, very important. Third generation to me is they didn't change that much. You just brought in new kinds of data. You brought in actually not just transactional data from humans, but speech data and everything that's on the internet, text data. And what else did you have? Well, instead of using random forests, we now put in neural networks because they somehow scale better. They're still kind of a gradient-based method. They're not that different. And you have GPUs in the cloud, and it's all bigger and all that. But in some ways, qualitatively, not that much changed, all right? But now because it's human data, it looks like it's artificially intelligent and people start going crazy about it, okay? We've got to re-own that dialogue. One way to re-own it is not just sort of say, we've seen this all before and all that, but to say, what's the real underlying phenomenon? And to me, it's not about taking a computer and making it intelligent, which is McCarthy's original goal. It's about these big systems, these collectives, which include lots and lots of devices and data and all that, but include lots and lots of people, critically. That's the part of the dialogue which is rarely emphasized. It has to be this social intersection, not of 10 people, not of 100, not of 1,000, but of 100 million. All right, and that's where I think we need to be thinking. All right, so if I were to give a talk about my vision of AI, which I don't want to do, but I'd say, well, it's not about the individual human intelligence and replicating that. That's a limited intelligence in some ways. In other ways, it's a very deep intelligence. Forget that for a moment. Collectives can be intelligent. Markets are intelligent. Collectives of animals are intelligent. We can envision new collectives arising in history. I think they will. We should work on those kind of things. And in fact, the design goals of technology should not be at the level of an individual entity, of a human imitating computer. It should be at the overall collective. Because what does the collective do? It does things like finance and transportation and healthcare, commerce. Those are the level at which things matter. The individual node processing data is not so important relative to that. So a good engineer would analyze the overall system and not the individual node. We don't do enough of that. All right, so back to academics for just one moment. You can sort of say, well, doesn't all this already happen in academics? Don't we kind of think about these big systems of commercial and healthcare from this point of view? The answer is basically no. We have these stovepipes. So we have statistics, we have economics and computer science, and I really mean even more broadly, kind of statistical thinking, other fields contribute to that. And you can ask, well, do they ever kind of come together? Well, in history, they've come together lots and lots of ways, but there are three pairwise interactions, which are actually quite strong, but very limited. All right, so you can ask, does statistics interact with computer science? Well, yeah, it does. That's exactly what machine learning is, nothing but that. All right, but does machine learning have any economics in it? And to first order, no. Machine learning is about predicting things in one individual node, and occasionally you'll talk about collectives, but not in a very, very limited way, not in an economics way, no incentives. All right, does statistics interact with economics? Oh, sure, that's econometrics. And many of you are econometricians, I'm sure. I see econometrics as also very limited. It doesn't have much mechanism design. It doesn't have discussion of the mechanism that delivers a certain kind of economic behavior. It's more about analyzing the economy, particularly the macroeconomic economy, okay? And it's basically time series analysis with an overdose of causal inference. So not much mechanism, not much computer science, in fact. What about economics meets computer science? Well, there's a field called algorithmic game theory. It has its own conferences too, and very interesting. It's real algorithms with combinatorial flavor and all that do economic mechanism design, all right? So auctions, mostly. Is there any statistics there? Basically, to first order, none. Okay? People design the auction just thinking about it, write down the auction and have a protocol and it gets executed. No, repeat it, get some data, see how it goes and make it better. All right, now the green region, of course, is where we want to be. And I want all the young people in the room to think that's where I want to be. Let me just say, whenever I go into industry, it's always in the middle of the green region somewhere. That's where the real problem resides. It's rarely on those points. I'll return to that throughout the talk. One more bashing of McCarthy. He had this notion of an individual human being the thing to imitate with our technology. It's not it's an interesting idea. It's fascinating, in fact, but it's overly fascinating somehow. It's overly fascinated people. And so as I alluded to, it doesn't make it clear what the overall engineering goal is of data analysis and decision making. And in fact, when you roll it out with the algorithms that we have at our disposal now, the neural nets and the gradient-based methods, you get these artifacts like ChatGPT, which are amazingly good at prediction, really amazingly good. Let me just say, I wouldn't want to minimize at all how strikingly good they are. This transformer architecture is amazing. But its treatment of uncertainty is terrible. Really in some ways absent. So if you ask ChatGPT, you just told me something, how sure are you of that? ChatGPT will give you an answer, but it's because somewhere in the past data, someone asked a question like that, and some human said, I'm sure or I'm not sure or something. And ChatGPT generalizes from that phrase of text. Right? I don't have to tell this audience, that's not reasoning under uncertainty. All right, now is that a problem? Well, yeah, because we reason under uncertainty all the time as humans, and intelligence is at least half that. It's us dealing with all of the vast uncertainty around us. And now an individual human is not so good at dealing with uncertainty, but if you put us in collectives, We feed off of each other, we inquire with each other, we learn from each other, and so the collective can mitigate uncertainty much better than an individual node. And so I think that limited perspective of AI is really hurting us. Moreover, if you take one of these terribly ill-equipped entities like ChatGPT and put it in the midst of a bunch of humans and you have multiple GPTs, uncertainty goes out the window, and that's a terrible system. I would want to interact in such a system. All right, so I think we need to fix all this. We need to do decision-making in collaborative systems, and we critically have to bring in economics. So we have to bring in, when you say economics, I mean microeconomics, and I mean mainly incentives. So the mathematics I'm going to show you in the talk is all about incentives. That's what's going to be new. It doesn't just look like Bayesian formulas or computer science. It's going to have incentives in there. The other concept I really, really find important from economics is an information asymmetry. When you have multiple entities working with each other, one of them knows more than the other. Happens all the time. And they don't just share their knowledge. There's strategic reasons. There's many, many reasons why they don't share their knowledge. You have these asymmetries, but they still have to work with each other despite the asymmetry. This is a huge part of modern economics. It's not part of general equilibrium theory, which is all symmetric, but it's part of modern economics. And information asymmetry is a form of uncertainty. I don't know what someone else knows, but I need to work with them, and I'm not going to get the information just by asking. And I'm not going to get it by sampling. Okay, so it looks very different from our classical statistical uncertainty, but it's hugely present. All right, one more little thought experiment. Recommendation systems, you all know what they are. I've already alluded to. They're a prediction system. They predict what purchase someone's going to make next in a stream of purchases. Are they a good kind of economics model? Well, I'm going to argue not so much. In particular, these systems are big black boxes, and they make lots of predictions every day for lots of people. If they were doing it for just one person, no problems are going to arise. But when you make predictions for lots and lots of people, tons of problems arise. These systems recommend movies to people. What if at sort of Netflix, the same movie gets recommended 100,000 times today? I'm sure that happens all the time. And 100,000, 10,000 people say, yeah, I want to watch that movie. They just copy the bits. There's no scarcity in the world of bits. Same thing with Amazon's original model of books. You could copy books as fast as you want nowadays, within an hour. And I'm sure that Amazon serves the same book, 10,000 times a day. They don't have to stockpile all of those. Right? What if you recommend things where there's scarcity? Right? What if you recommend the same restaurant to everyone? Well, you cannot copy the restaurant on demand. Right? So what will happen is that you will create congestion. All right? And this happens a lot with real-world recommendation systems and machine learning. People say, oh my God, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. And then what the response is, we should load balance somehow. We should never send 10,000 people to the same restaurant. Let's cap it at 100. And the whole question is, which 100? So with college admissions, you would never do this sort of, let's cap it at 100 and just take the first 100 who apply. Be a terrible economic model. And kidney exchange, you just never do this. All right, but weirdly, Silicon Valley thinks that's kind of a solution to this kind of problem. You fix a decision-making system by post hoc processing. Okay? Same thing happens if you recommend streets to drivers. You can't copy the street if there's too many people wanting to go down the street, so you created congestion. And again, you don't want to just give the street to the first people that arrived or the richest people or the, whatever. You need to get an economic system behind that with utilities and people that interact and more actively, expressing preferences. Okay, so I argue that problems of this kind in the real world where there's scarcity. Let me just say that word scarcity is very much of an economics word. And if you read Silicon Valley type people, which I don't do, but I gather like Sam Altman says this kind of thing all the time. He says there's going to be no scarcity. And just think about how silly that is, how fundamentally silly that is. Okay, there's hugely going to be scarcity, probably more than ever before. And we have to manage that scarcity with our prediction systems and with our machine learning systems. All right, so I think of problems like this are not just prediction or inference. If you treat them that way, you will create problems in the world, okay? They are matching markets. The examples I gave you are all matching markets. People over on this side of the market have utilities for matches on this side and vice versa, and we want to find good matches and do that at very, very large scale, hundreds of millions of items. If you ask machine learning people, don't you work on things like this, which they mostly don't, they will say, well, we have federated learning. All right, so this is a Google terminology, and what it is, it's a decentralized learning paradigm, but there's basically no economic model here at all. You have a central server, which is trying to gather as much data as possible. So it's trying to build a speech recognition system or a ChatGPT type system. So it tries to get as much data as it can, and a lot of the data lives on cell phones. All right, so they're going to grab the data from the cell phones, and of course people don't like that so much, so they're going to make a guarantee, we'll guarantee your privacy. We'll add noise or whatever, we'll have mechanisms. And so now people are all reassured and they don't mind that you grab all my data. Not really. Now what does Google do with that data? They build this centralized model, and then it's a really good model for speech or language or whatever, and then they give it to the world, free. And so they're the good guys. All right? All right, but maybe I put something of real value into that system. Maybe I wrote a song, or I wrote a novel on my cell phone, which is happening all the time among young people. And you grabbed it, and now you gave it back to everybody free, but it's not really free because you advertised against it, or you sold it, and you made a lot of money, and you didn't give that back to me. Okay, this is just terribly broken economics. Let me give a counterexample. So I've been working on this for now many years, about 10. As some of you know, I'm actually a musician as well, and I've been working with Steve Stout, who's a legendary hip-hop producer in the United States. He's a friend of mine, and he and I have a shared perspective on machine learning should be for the creation of markets and not for just platforms and services. So United Masters is a company that has been existing for about 7 or 8 years now. It is really working. It has 3 million musicians on it. It is a three-way market, okay? And it's all based on data analysis. One corner of the market is the musicians, and these are typically young people between 15 and 25. That's a typical writer of a song these days. They make huge numbers of songs, and they're really good, and that's what most people actually listen to, unbelievably. It's not that most people listen to Beyonce and whatever, Taylor Swift. Unbelievably, it's a huge long tail. Most of the mass is in the tail, and it's these young people making songs and young people listening to those songs, okay? So it seems like there's this great market there that's this fervent thing, and actually the answer has been no. But anyway, there's 3 million musicians on this platform. They sign on. Their songs are now distributed and mastered through this company, United Masters. The listeners also have access to these streams, and the musicians get to see who's listening to them a little bit more than usually. They have more visibility, so they can make offers, like I'll come play your daughter's wedding. But mostly importantly is there's also brands. That's the third side of the market. Brands include like the National Basketball Association. So Steve knows people like LeBron, and he signed contract with the NBA that when the music is played on the NBA website for some clip, that music is streamed from United Masters, and when it is, a particular artist gets paid, typically a 15-year-old. Right? When the NBA sees that, they start to see that that 15-year-old is popular on my website. Nike also gets to see that and says, we like that demographic. They'll reach out to that musician and say, we want to work with you. That's happening now all the time. All right, so of those 3 million musicians, several tens of thousands are actually now making what I would call a salary. Okay, they're not becoming rich, but they're like in a sort of professor level salary, let us say. Well, let's be clear, a French level professor salary. Okay, so anyway, I could go on and on about this, but this is a thriving AI system. Data is flowing all the directions, but critically, data is not just bits, it's music. And so it can be valued, and that value can be associated with actual money. And this could actually lead to a creative market that does do kinds of creative things. Steve has also gone to Brazil. He's United Masters starting up in Brazil and Africa. And I think this model is going to take over. The record companies are all scared about this, by the way. All right, so in general, not just music, but everything that people create in their lives, often on their cell phones. They are creators. These nodes are not just data sources to be streamed and think about the bits and all that. It's really, we should think about what is the creative act behind all of this and think about new kinds of markets of the kind that never existed before. 3,000 years ago, we had people bringing goods to markets. Well, we should have new markets now, and we basically don't. We have companies stealing stuff from people, making it free, and then get money from advertising. That's a very, very strange and bad economic model. Okay, so to return to this, really what we need to be is in that green area, because exactly things like United Masters are right in the middle of that green area. There's quite a bit of computer science here, as you can imagine. There's also statistics. We have to do all this analysis, and then there's this matching market kind of concept. And it's all adaptive and all done online. Okay, so that was the first part of my talk. So I've been doing this for about 10 years now. Well, the first part of the 10 years I was working on the first bullet there, okay? So relations among optima, equilibria, and dynamics. I sort of saw this coming, but only in a very limited way. I didn't know hardly any economics. But in our field, we're very good at talking about optimization, either in a literally optimization or in a MCMC kind of way. But in the problems I'm talking about, optima aren't very interesting. It's all about equilibria. Okay, and so can we find equilibria in high-dimensional spaces, of hundreds of millions? Okay, interesting question. Equilibria are often variational inequalities or fixed points. We're very good at finding zeros of potential fields, but can we find fixed points? Interesting change of perspective. Moreover, in these problems I'm interested in, there's rarely just fixed equilibria. Things are moving around. And so you need dynamical systems that move towards good, favorable fixed points, and it's all driven stochastically because it's all statistical. All right. Now I'm going to do a little bit of shameless advertising. That bullet I'm not going to talk about, but my previous talk at ISBA was all about that. That's what I was working on, the last, maybe 10 years ago to 5 years ago. And so here's some of the papers I'm particularly proud of that you'll find on my website. That the first paper turned optimization problems into continuous time, and then worked out Hamiltonian and variational perspectives on optimization. And we were able to explain Nesterov acceleration and all. And we saw lots of phenomena in continuous time that you could not see in discrete time. That was kind of the revelation in that first paper. And then all the work after that was done, and always in continuous time. We were able to get rates of convergence for non-convex optimization with this kind of way of thinking, upper bounds and lower bounds for finding non-saddle points in high-dimensional spaces where high is very, very high, and we have really good algorithms that have upper and lower bounds that are tight. All right, then we moved on to constraints, and still in continuous time. And continuous time constraints can be expressed as accelerations. Very interesting perspective on constraints. Then we started looking at convergence of saddle point optimization. So now we're getting into equilibria. So in saddle point is zero-sum games. At least we're now moving towards equilibria, and we worked on that. Then we to variational inequalities, which is beyond saddle points. More, all kinds of other equilibria can be expressed as variational inequalities. And then this last paper I'm particularly proud of, where it all becomes adaptive and doubly robust, where you don't have to know step sizes a priori, which is really important in this decentralized setting. Okay, so that was advertising. Let me return to the talk. All right, so what I decided to do is to pick some vignettes from the rest of this list. On my page, you will find papers on all these topics. I've been very interested in incentive theoretic statistics. And so I'm going to pick some vignettes. And my goal in this part of the talk is to show you a little vignette, meaning I'm going to show you a problem, motivate it from hopefully a fairly real-world perspective, and then make it clear there's a statistics part and an economics part. There will also be some optimization and some computer science, but that's the least important for this talk. I really want to make clear what's the statistics and economics and why each one of them by themselves would not solve the problem. But you bring them together, you solve the problem. Okay? And I will show you some solutions. There'll be a couple of theorems and some actual math, but really the solutions are mostly in the papers, which I'll hopefully some of you will want to look at later. Okay, so to start, I'm going to give a little primer on mechanism design. I'm sure some of you know this even well better than me, but it's important to have terminology at least. All right, so microeconomics is supported by lots of branches of mathematics, dynamical systems, mostly, and optimization theory, topology, including index theory. Certainly variational inequalities. If you don't know what variational inequalities are, I'd highly encourage it. It's kind of an Italian specialty. Facchine in Rome is a world leader on it. But especially when we have strategic agents and not just kind of economic interactions, then we have game theory. And you all know probably a fair amount of game theory. Game theory is kind of the forward model. Okay? It generates predictions. It's all about predictions. You write down a game, you run the game, and you get a prediction of behavior. You might see outcomes, allocations or revenues or whatever. And then you say, is that what happens in real life? Therefore, if yes, then my game is a good model of real life. And so it's like physics. F equals ma is just a model. You run it forward, you see something falling, and you say, well, look, that looks like nature, and so it's a good model. We're often, in more engineering settings, interested in the inverse problem. The inverse problem is, I want an outcome of some kind, some allocation, some revenue. What game do I design to achieve that outcome? Okay? The inverse of game theory is called mechanism design. Now, game theory has multiple branches, many, many branches, but roughly speaking, there are two main kinds. There's sequential games and there's simultaneous games. Simultaneous games is like rock, paper, scissors and prisoner's dilemma. Agents come together, they make some decisions simultaneously, and they see the outcome. And you all know the equilibrium concept there. How do you solve the game? That's a Nash equilibrium. The more probably important kind of game in modern economics is the Stackelberg game, where there's a leader and a follower. The leader makes a choice, the follower gets to see that choice and then acts accordingly. The leader knows that the follower is going to make a choice after they've seen that, so they think ahead. Right? And so leader-follower often have these iterated flavor and kind of going backwards kind of solution concepts. And the equilibrium concept there is called a Stackelberg equilibrium. All right, now, if I start with the Nash problem, I've got agents that come in simultaneously and even maybe symmetrically. The solution concept is a Nash equilibrium. The inverse of that is an auction. Okay, and an auction is a way to bring people together to deliver a desired outcome, in particular that the item goes to the person who wants it the most and that there's high revenue. Okay? All right, so if you talk about Nash equilibrium auctions, you're kind of in the forward-backward space. This whole talk is not about Nash equilibrium, it's about Stackelberg. I think that's way more important, especially for statisticians, than Nash equilibria. And the corresponding inverse problem is called contract. Okay, and so contract theory is a branch of microeconomics that probably few of you know about. I didn't know anything about it until about 3 years ago. I picked up a wonderful book by Lafont and Martimore. It's called Theory of Incentives. It has it's just a big tome on contract theory. It's a beautiful theory. I'm going to tell you about it a little bit. All right, and I think as a statistician, if you haven't already learned about contract theory, you're going to want to learn about it. Here's a one-page primer on contract theory. Okay, so contract theory is where we have these leaders and followers, and we're going to have asymmetry of information. The leader and the follower know different things. Okay? They're going to need to work together, but they know different things. So we have private information now. And already if you're Bayesian, you sort of say, yeah, that's great. I'm used to inverse problems, and I'm used to private information. This feels good to me. Okay, so you all know what contract theory is already. And so the best example of this is the airlines. In the 1980s, when I was a person, in the 1980s, if you go into an airplane, every seat costs the same. Unbelievable, like the movie theaters these days. Every seat costs the same. All right, and so the airlines were making money, losing money, whatever, mostly losing money. And so in that era, some low-cost airlines arose, and they said, we're going to bring the costs down, just by cutting all of our marginal costs, because the costs were pretty high. All right, and they did, and the national airlines started to all die. Like Pan Am and Brand all died. The American airlines, because the government didn't come in and save them, just died. The European ones like Air France, there's no way the French are going to let Air France die, so they just pumped money into it. Okay, that couldn't go on forever. The raison d'etre of these low-cost airlines was just to kick out all these other companies, and they would come in and they would raise the cost, but still maybe not too bad. That's what their goal was. There was an economist at American Airlines, and I've forgotten his name, I should know this, but it's a very well-known story in economics. He said, well, I know this thing called contract theory. All you got to do is you got to realize that there's different willingness to pay among all of your customers, and it's a big, big gap. Some people, to get from here to Bologna, are willing to pay 1,000 euros because they really got to go, really important. Or they're rich, or whatever, for whatever reason, but they really will pay a lot. A lot of other people, maybe their willingness to pay is only 100 euros. That's all they would pay to get from here to Bologna, okay? And it's a huge range. Now, if you knew that a priori, you'd give a price accordingly. You'd tell the person who was willing to pay more, you give them a higher price. Now, that's called first-degree price discrimination. You can't do it. It's illegal. But also you just can't do it. I mean, I could look at Ed George and say, look at that guy, gray hair, professor, look to him. He will pay 1,000 euros for sure. So I say, yeah, it's going to cost you 1,000 euros. I'm not going to pick out a name of someone in the audience, but some student is wearing shorts and looking kind of student-like. I say, okay, 100 euros, you're on the plane. What'll happen is tomorrow Ed will start looking, more like a student again. So the airlines knew this, they knew they couldn't do this. So what they did is they did contract theory. And you all know what it is, business class, economy class. This is where that came from. All right, and so business class, so there's a service and a price, You can invent the service and you can invent the price. It's a list, it's a menu of options. That's what a contract is. It's a menu of options. And the prices are different for the service. And you can make it up. And so for the younger people in the room, you won't know what this thing is called business class, but it is, it's a thing where you get to be first in line, and you get a little glass of red wine, and you get a slightly bigger seat, and you pay way more, and you feel really good about yourself. All right. So you get on the plane feeling great, and then the younger people walk past that section. They don't know what it is, but they sense there's something wrong with it. And they get on the same airplane paying only 100 euros, and they feel really good about themselves too. And the airline feels really good because they got the airline full of different tiered number of prices. The willingness to pay has been partly captured. All right, so American Airlines returned to profitability within a year and kicked out the low-cost things, and now we have it everywhere. And then all these things like stay over a Saturday night and all, that's all examples of this. Now you may hate all of this, most of us do, but we would not have airlines without it. There's not a viable economy without it. What does this have to do with statistics? Well, first of all, behind the scenes, they have to do all kinds of adjustment, they're doing ad hoc statistics there. Terribly ad hoc. They could do way better if they really, wrote down Bayes' formula. So I'm going to show you now an example of something that is contract theory, but it's really statistical at its foundations. So this is with Stephen, who's now at MIT, Michael, who's joined a company, and Jake, who's at Chicago. And they were all with me at Berkeley. Okay, so there's some clinical trials experts in the room. I won't pretend to be a clinical trial expert, but you all know they exist, and they cost many tens of millions of dollars a year in the US to run phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in each area of medicine. And basically, it costs so much because you're running these tests. You need to do a randomized controlled trial. You have to bring in 36,000 people on one arm, another 36,000 on the other arm, and you try it out. Okay, so is it being done well? Well, I'm sure many of you in the room don't think so. It should be more Bayesian, it should be more than this and that, but there's, I think, a much bigger problem, which is it's not being done in an economically sound way, in an incentive theoretic way. Okay, so how should the FDA test? Well, here's just the dumbest possible version of what they're doing. A medication can be proposed, a new medicine, so it's just a piece of protein, some kind of a medication. Could be either a bad drug or a good drug. A bad drug doesn't mean it hurts anybody. They've kind of screened for that, but it just means it's not effective. And there's tons of those on the market. Theta is equal to 1 means it's actually effective. All right, and so they do their randomized controlled trials such that they control the false positive rate at, say, 0.05. It's actually more like 0.001. And they control their power at something like 0.8. It's actually a little bit higher, but not that much higher. Okay, so they're really good at this. These are statisticians, and they screen, and this is not done in a dumb way. But you can ask, is this a good protocol? And the answer would be, sure, it's optimal. It's the Neyman Pearson test. It has to be, yes. And the answer, maybe. But in real practice, it doesn't work. And so here's the issue. Case 1 is where you might make a small profit. 20 million to run the trial, 200 million if you're accepted. That would be a very niche drug. And now the CEO can do a calculation. She can say counterfactually, if theta is equal to 0, I don't know if that's true or not, but maybe let's imagine all the numbers here on the page, and I can calculate the expected profit in that counterfactual will be minus 10 million. So I go to my engineers and I say, only send in candidates to the FDA if you're really sure they're good. So there's a little bit of hidden knowledge there. They do know something about the protein. They've been working on it for years, and so they know something. There's where it comes in. So they send mostly good candidates. Now the hypothesis testing machinery kicks in, screens them well, and we only have good drugs going to the market. Problem is, it's more like on the right. Large profit to be made. 20 million to run the trial. It might cost you, you might make 2 billion if you're approved, like ibuprofen. And so now your expected profit will be 80 million, even if the drug is not effective. How could that be? Well, again, it's a false positive rate, and if you throw in enough drugs, you're going to, a lot of them will get through, and now they'll go on the market. They won't hurt anybody per se, but people could have been taking better drugs, so people will have died. And this is our system. All right, so I think other than fixing up the statistics and making it more Bayesian, whatever you want to do, I think that the real problem is you need to bring in contract theory. All right, because this is a contract theory situation. The FDA is a principal. It only has partial knowledge. Here's some protein. The FDA doesn't know much about that protein. The pharmaceutical companies, the agent, they know a lot about it, and they're not willing just to give the information to the FDA for many reasons, competitive and otherwise. They will lie if asked. Okay? So the FDA has a job to do, which is to put good drugs on the market, and the pharmaceutical companies also want good drugs to go to the market somehow, but they want to make profit too. The incentives are not aligned. How do you make them aligned? You do a contract. All right, so here's our version of a statistical contract. You could do others. So this is a protocol which is offered to the agent when they arrive, the pharmaceutical company. If you want to opt into this protocol, you do this. Otherwise, you could just walk away. That's fine too. That's part of the math. You can walk away. If you opt in, you pay a reservation price R, say 20 million. And now you're going to choose a payout function from a menu. Payout function is going to be a function of the evidence. And it will have things like licensing terms, how much you can invest, how many states you can do this in, all kinds of the usual licensing terms of a drug. We will design the menu. The menu is going to be like business class, economy class. It'll have some options, some licensing terms, and some prices. Now a statistical trial is run. That's what's new. You won't find that in Lafont and Martimore. That's step 3. The statistical trial samples a random variable from P of theta. Theta is the true theta that no one knows in this problem. But nature knows it. So nature gives you a sample from the truth. You plug that sample into F, and that is the payoff that the agent receives. They got to pick F, Z, and they pick with some pre-knowledge of what they expect from Z. So there's where the knowledge come in. And then the principal gets a utility, which is also depending on how much had to be paid, obviously. And also it depends on theta, because in the long term, people will notice if the FDA is doing a good job or not. Now, that's a mathematical object. We can start to analyze it. We can analyze its Stackelberg equilibria. We can analyze whether it controls all error rates. In this case, we're doing false positive, false, and power under our model, okay? Now, to make this into economics, it's not enough just to write down those things. You have to actually make sure you're clear on what the incentives are. And so in this case, it's actually pretty simple. You say, under the null hypothesis, and so in that gray box there, you'll see expectation of Z under the null hypothesis, P of theta naught. Under the null hypothesis, suppose Z is coming from a drug which is not effective, all right? I want it to be the case that my payout minus my reservation price is negative on average. Otherwise, the pharmaceutical companies could just make money, for free. Okay, so that's going to be my minimal incentive compatibility constraint. All right, so I can ask, is a contract that I've designed incentive aligned or not? That's going to be a yes/no mathematical question, if it respects that expectation or not. Testing at P less or equal to 0.5 does not. It's easy to prove that that's not the case. All right, so now we have a theorem, finally. We have proved in this paper that a contract is incentive aligned if and only if all of the payoff functions are E-values. Okay? E-values are kind of the modern version, better than P-values. E-values are non-negative random variables whose expectation is less or equal to 1 under the null. Okay, so if the null is true, this is not going to amplify your wealth in that metaphor. Okay, it'll kind of reduce things. All right. In generality, E-values are not just non-negative random variables, they are non-negative super martingales. Okay? So we know that they can be put together more readily than P-values. They're martingales, you can stop them in kind of martingale style. And so they're kind of an improved version of P-values. That's great, but this theorem goes further. It says if and only if. It says that a contract in statistical contract theory is incentive aligned if and only if all of the functions in it are non-negative super martingales. Okay, so now we can go back to the FDA, and we're doing that, and to other places, and say, we got a design tool. All of your contracts have to be written in the language of non-negative super martingales. If they are, we're good. We're incentive aligned. Okay? And that gives you a very different set of contracts than the ones you design ad hoc. All right. We have a follow-up paper, which I want to spend a few minutes on, with the same author. Stephen led this. Which is really getting closer to the Bayesian problem. That one had Bayesian in it, but we also were doing frequentist error control. So suppose we have a principal who just wants to conduct Bayesian inference, okay? That's the principal's goal in life, is they have some data, they want to do Bayesian inference. But they're not very knowledgeable, and they don't have a prior that they believe, okay? They could use some non-informative blah, 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 but they know better. I shouldn't talk that way, but I've had enough industrial experience. Now, instead, what they do is they go look for an agent who has got an informity prior, who knows something, and they like to work with that agent. But they can't just say, agent, tell me your prior. The agent probably can't and maybe won't, and will probably lie, because they want to get some benefit out of this deal. All right, so can we have a principal who does Bayesian inference while engaging in a contractual economic relationship with an agent? And it seems plausibly that we can, right? Because if I set up the contract in a certain way, you're going to look through that list of options, and you're going to pick an option which is favorable to you. In the moment you do that, I will see that, and I will have learned something about your prior, very indirectly, but I will have learned something about your prior. Okay, so that's the key. All right, and that may or may not be new. I don't know. I think it's interesting. All right, and so how do we do this? All right, well, first of all, we have to, so let me just say, in economics, there's this concept of revealed preferences. That's a whole area of economics, and we're kind of in that spirit. Here's our protocol. This is kind of a tweak on the one we had before, kind of the simpler version of what we had before. The principal chooses a decision policy, which is maps from some form of evidence, E-value or P-value, whatever, to an approve or deny decision. The agent is now going to decide to run a trial or not. They could opt out, but we want to incentivize them to play the game. The trial, if it's run, then you collect evidence according to nature's distribution. Now the decision, the principal will make a decision based on what they picked, the F they picked. And if it's approved, the agent receives a reward. So this is a very clear protocol and game akin to the one we had before. Now you can start to write down some functions. Let's suppose the principal's decision is just a thresholding at level tau. And so the power function as a function of tau is just going to be the probability that you're less than or equal to tau under theta. The expected profit, and here's where again the economics will come in, is a function that we're going to call Q here. So Q is the expectation under the agent's prior, all right, of the reward they get times the power function minus the cost they had to play the game. So there's a little bit of game theoretic probability already happening here, I hope you can see. But anyway, that is the expected profit for the agent. All right, so suppose, now here's the theorem, if the agent runs a trial, if and only if that profit is positive, suppose that's true, which, that's the incentive, then the posterior odds of a non-null given approval is bounded from below. Because that's an inferential statement. I can say something about the posterior odds for the principal using the agent's prior. Okay, and that something is a lower bound in this particular case. We also have an upper bound. And that lower bound depends on economic parameters. The cost to play the game, the reward if you win the game, and the threshold, which you get to pick. Okay, so I'll encourage you to look at that paper, and I gave this to the discussants. They may have more to say about it. There's lots more to do here. This is just the first tip of an iceberg. Okay, so I have 8 minutes left, I think. Let me just briefly tell you about another project which has huge information asymmetry component to it. A little less about incentives. Let me spend a couple minutes on that, and then I want to say a little bit more about incentives, and then I'll close. This project has been a big part of all of our lives in the last 2 years. These are my students at Berkeley, and Stephen has now moved on to MIT. We call this prediction-powered inference, so it's very much a Finetti kind of theme. And it's kind of in this AI for science vein. AlphaFold makes wonderful predictions of proteins, better than anybody, better than we would have thought possible. All right, so there is a tendency now to say we could replace scientific data gathering with things like AlphaFold predictions. So here's an example. Someone back in 2004 studying whether there's a relationship between quantum disorder of proteins and phosphorylation, whether the protein is active or not. So quantum disorder is kind of when something didn't quite fold, there's like a hanging strand, and that used to be thought of as a broken protein. But then it seemed to be clear that you could take many of those and put strands together, make little grids, and put them in membranes of cells, and now control flow. That turns out probably to be true. So these people were trying to test that. So they just looked at the whole protein data bank and said, disorder, yes or no, phosphorylation, yes or no, made a little 2x2 table, did a hypothesis test. Turned out they didn't have enough data to reject the null, so they didn't. Someone came along 20 years later and said, well, now we have AlphaFold. We don't have to restrict ourselves to 10,000 data points, which is what the protein data bank had. We could get 200 million data points, because it's from AlphaFold, which is extremely accurate. So let's reduce all that to a little 2x2 table, do the hypothesis test, And they did, and they got out a very narrow confidence interval. They used confidence intervals, and they rejected the null very clearly. Okay, was this the right thing to do? Okay, first of all, it's being done all over the place. You can pick up any copy of Science or Nature recently. AI for science is all the rage. We're going to argue that it's not the right thing to do. All right, so here we redid the whole experiment. We took all of the big data and everything. We took half of it, we just held that aside, and we did a big Monte Carlo to get a notion of ground truth. For the odds ratio, is the little 2x2 statistic. That's the dotted line, so the true odds ratio seems to be around 2. The confidence interval coming from using AlphaFold data, quote unquote, is that gold region. You can see it's extremely sure of itself, and it's not even close to covering the truth at all. Okay? Pretty bad. If you say forget the AlphaFold approach at all, just take what data we have. Currently, we have now 100,000 data points in the protein data bank. That gives you the gray region. Still covers 1. 20 years later, we still can't reject the null. All right, so we have a new method we call prediction-powered inference, which kind of puts the two together. All right, it's able to use a little bit of gold standard data, 10,000, 100,000 data points in this case, together with all of AlphaFold, and in some sense debias the confidence interval. Okay, I want to say much more about that, but it'll give you the green region, which provably covers the truth. We did frequentist analysis here because the people seeing this work wanted to see a theorem, so we gave them one. And it tends to be much more narrow than forget the AlphaFold altogether. Now, why is this happening? Well, we went back and looked, and we found that there were lots of proteins, like one on the left, that AlphaFold said that's the protein, all folded up, but actually the true protein had a strand hanging down. There was quantum disorder. There was lots of this. Why? Well, because AlphaFold didn't see a lot of data with quantum disorder in it, because it was looking at all of the previous proteins from previous science. All right? Scientists tend to be on the edge looking at new phenomena that hasn't been measured that much. And they will often find cases where, in fact, AlphaFold's actually quite wrong, even though on average it's really, really good. I think this is happening, will happen all throughout science a lot. All right, so this methodology, I hope, is just off the shelf. We put it in the journal Science, and it's being picked up by a lot of people. We hope that it'll be just kind of become, we have to do this or something like this instead of just relying on these AI for science ideas. We did this in a whole bunch of other areas in that paper. You'll see the examples. This is like a little gene expression thing. You design a little piece of DNA, you throw it in, and you ask, does it get expressed or not? There's machine learning predictions, and over there you'll see the little gold interval. Again, it's very narrow to cover the truth. Green region covers the truth and is pretty narrow too. Here's my favorite example. It's a little econometric example. Let me not get into details, but you can see the machine learning confidence interval is extremely narrow and is way far from the truth. So it's very sure of itself, you would not know otherwise, and very wrong. All right, now if you use our method, you get the green region, which is only a little bit better than the throw out the machine learning thing, which is good. That means we're being honest. If you try to correct something using a very bad model, it shouldn't correct it too good. And our method takes that into account. Here's a little bit of frequentist calculation that convinces you that this works and shows you how it works. It basically becomes a point estimate minus a set estimate, and it kind of moves the set in a particular way. I don't want to get it. This is for M estimation. You'll see this in the paper if you choose to. Okay, last few minutes. I want to return to what now is my next 20 years of my career. So this is all about incentives and privacy and markets and regulation. I moved to Europe because they love to regulate much more than in the US. And I want to help them regulate bad because they're doing a terrible job. And these are some of my brilliant colleagues that I'm currently working with at Berkeley, Navasini, Alireza, Nika, and Mina. And I'm just going to set up a couple of problems. How am I doing on time, literally? So 3 minutes. Okay, I got 3 little vignettes, a minute each. All right, so these are little set up the problem, and you'll see a little of the statistics meets the inference, and that's kind of all I want to do here. Economic efficiency and privacy. We all talk a lot about privacy. Privacy is economics. If you want something from me and I have to give up a little bit of information to you, but you give me something in return, I want to give it up. I don't want to just have privacy yes or no. I checked some box and everything is private. That's nonsense. All right, so in particular, price discrimination is often a good thing. If you know something about me, like I'm an older person or I'm a student, you can give me a discount, I'm happy about that. You need to know something about me. And that happens throughout any decent economy. All right, so third degree price discrimination, let's just look at the case of a monopolist. They want to sell a product to a continuum of customers, the values are distributed in some way, and they are going to be able to set a price you know, the simplest case, a single price for everybody, but in general, they want to set different prices for different segments of the market. And you want to ask, what kind of utilities can I get out for the consumer and for the producer if I segment in different ways? And there's a famous paper by Bergman et al., 2015, very important paper, that led to this little triangle that they got analytically. Here's consumer utility, and here's producer utility over all possible segmentations of the market, where different prices are given to different segmentations. This is a very famous triangle, and as a regulator, you can ask, can I make sure that I'm in certain parts of that triangle? Do I want to prefer consumers, producers, and this is a design tool. We asked, what happens if this becomes more statistical and we impose a privacy mechanism? All right, so at the bottom of the page, you'll see our mechanism was just randomized response. So we took the data, we added a little noise to it. Okay, and you can ask, this is going to mess things up a little bit for the producer. They're not going to be able to quite see the segments. They're going to get them wrong. And if they price them accordingly, they're going to lose some utility. But does it help the consumer? And the answer is we were able to do the theory, and Bergman's triangle shifted. It came down a little bit and over a little bit, and it's no longer a triangle, but it's a projection of a high-dimensional polytope. All right, and so we're able to make qualitative conclusions now. First of all, this is mostly bad for the producer. Their most achievable revenue comes down, and they can do even worse. But the consumer, there's kind of a buffer zone. They will definitely do better than the worst case. And so we're able to kind of tell you how to navigate around that and talk to regulators about that. So we're able to write down qualitative conclusions about this and talk to actual government people. All right, number 2 vignette, and I think I may stop with this one. 3-layer data markets. I'm very interested in these data markets. Here's an example of them. Here we have users like you and me. We want to get services from some platforms like Google or MasterCard. They provide the service and they get our data in return. A lot of those platforms can't make enough money just from our data and for the service, so they sell their data to a third party. The third party then does various things like, market, investigations and so on. And they want to get good data, and they'll pay for this. And so a lot of these platforms only make enough money from this. All right, now you think about the incentives. That's the data. What about the incentives? Well, these guys, to get lots of data and provide the service, are going to have to make some promises. For example, privacy guarantees. They're going to have to say, well, we're going to do differential privacy. We'll add this much noise to the data. The other competitor says, we'll even add more noise. More private here, less private here. If it's more private, more customers will probably go to that guy. So if this guy says, I'm more private, we'll get more customers coming here. Therefore, I get more data. Therefore, I can build a better model and have a better service. I have more data. The data buyer might be happy. Oops, but it's more noisy data. All right? And moreover, the person over here doesn't necessarily want this data buyer to get all this stuff, so they prefer this for the more private site. But on the other hand, they want to go to the site that has the better service. So you can see it's an entangled set of incentives, and it's all statistical. Every one of those has a power function or whatever kind of, a little statistical quantity. And you can now make a tangled Stackelberg equilibrium out of all of this and solve for that. And we have algorithms that will do that. We don't want to now get just mathematical results. We want to get actual algorithms, and these are now variational inequalities. So we start to write it down, and I guess here just make a couple of comments. The GDPR, you all know about that in Europe, it just sort of said, privacy is good, and that's it. No ifs, ands, buts. And what's happening now is lots of mid-market companies are being driven out of business by this overly stringent privacy law that's not targeted in the right way. All right, so our theory makes predictions about privacy regulations. And just briefly, if you have a full ban on sharing, if you add infinite noise, that helps user utility, but it definitely hurts producer utility and data buyer utility. And there are zones in the middle where there are kind of minimum privacy thresholds, which help everybody. Okay, so you can make a little phase diagram of where you help who and how, and you can show this to a government people, and we're actually doing that in France. All right, last little point just to say what it was. Contract design, we talked about a minute ago. A lot of the companies that are making products, they're doing it with contracts, and you want to make sure they do respect safety considerations. You can say, did you do the safety check, Ed? And I'll say, sure. I say, well, Ed, there's a probability 0.1 that I'm going to do a test for you afterwards. You know that now when you made your answer, and now the incentives come into play. So we work all of that out, and we're able to do safety as well in the context of these things. Last slide, and now I'm done. I'll leave this one up. This is a little bit provocative. It's not provocative that we're in an era where everyone's talking about AI. It's just ridiculous, and they call it intelligence, even though it's arguably not. An alternative perspective I've emphasized here is that intelligence is about the collective. So if we're going to engage, I think we shouldn't be just talking about the algorithm and the data. We should be talking about the overall context, which includes lots and lots of people and their values. And we should therefore partner with economists more than we have in the past, especially microeconomists. So we got to blend these traditions. And I would argue that Finetti would find this totally reasonable. He said, I'm already in an insurance company. I do this all the time. And somehow the Bayesian community has lost part of that spirit of Finetti, I would argue. They've gone for his little integral equation, and they've lost the context. All right, so I think the modern context, in fact, is not just Finetti's. It has planetary scale computing. It has huge, amazing connectivity. It has massive data flows. And so it's far beyond what von Neumann, Finetti, Arrow, and all had in mind and would have envisaged. All right, so they would have said, oh my God, we got work to do, and rolled up their sleeves, I think. And my question is the Bayesian community ready to take on this job? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that talk. We'll hold audience questions to the end of the session, and instead we're going to have two discussions now. The first one will be by David Dunson from Duke. David, take it away.
Hi, thanks a lot, Mike, for that great talk. Mike, we go back years, and he's always very pleasant to listen to and thought-provoking. And I'll give a caveat to start that he sent the slides last night at midnight, but he did generously send a couple papers that it was based on earlier. I'll also give another caveat that I know nothing at all about economics, and to me, the statistical content was a bit questionable, I guess. But I'll start out with it's a very well-deserved congratulations. Obviously, Mike is like a giant in the field, not just of Bayesian statistics, but in computer science, economics, machine learning. He's had a ridiculously huge impact, and there really isn't anyone more deserving of the Finetti Lecture Award than Mike. So I'll skip that. So I just say he's like, I think that one thing that we should kind of learn from Mike is that he's like one of these rare individuals who's like immensely creative, and so he's not trying to like jump into some area that's well developed and chip away at that area like a lot of us tend to do, but he tries to step back and say like, well, what are the big open problems in the field? How can I move things forward? How can I sort of transform the field broadly? And so I think that it would be great for more of us to try to aspire to just a baby version of that. Would be amazing. Okay, so the version I had a couple papers, and so one was particularly focused on this kind of pharmaceutical application in this sort of contract theory world. And I'll just give some first thoughts. I mean, I tend to be, in Mike's triangle, very, very far from the econ and much more towards the statistical, and then maybe I also have like a science. Maybe it's a rectangle in my case, and I'm sort of between statistics and like science with less of the other. But so from that perspective, my kind of first thoughts on contract theory, and so I said that already, it's like very much in Mike's awesome spirit or style of kind of avoiding bandwagons and trying to charge into different areas and kind of revolutionize them. And another thing I thought in reading through these papers is like initially it's like, well, where's the statistics? But I think that one of the reasons for that is that as Bayesian statisticians, we tend to think about much more and too narrowly about like the prior and the likelihood, and we have some data and we're modeling the data. And we're just thinking about that problem in isolation of the broader context of what Bayesian statistics is, and we forget the role of decision theory and loss functions and what is the goal of collecting the data in the first place. And I think that's an important take-home message to not really do that and to kind of think carefully, narrowly about this, just modeling the prior and the likelihood and then doing the kind of posterior computation, turn the crank. So So yeah, so we really want to think about, well, what's the focus? And in these kind of complicated problems that Mike was talking about, you have this kind of really intricate focus on like designing a contract or how do you set that up? And you have this kind of differing information across the two people involved or two agencies. And so then it becomes, maybe it is really a statistical problem and we can use Bayesian statistics, maybe even in the absence of any direct data. But we're more moving away from this kind of classical setting, which most of us, I think, are often in, where I have a particular data type. How do I choose my prior? How do I choose my likelihood? How do I do posterior computation? Okay, so he has this contract thing, and so the one that I'm more familiar with is I have collaborations with the pharmaceutical industry a bit, and then I have a background in biostatistics, and so I thought to kind of zoom in and think a little bit about this kind of contract theory in the setting of this kind of biopharmaceutical set where you're like, do I take this drug to trial or not? Okay. So I think it raises a lot of questions, and I know that Mike was not trying to describe like a realistic version of contract theory in this setting. He was just sort of trying to illustrate that as an example. But nonetheless, I thought it would be interesting to kind of try to think about that in a little bit more detail, okay? So the setting is that the agent or the company has this kind of private information, their own prior about the drug efficacy theta, and so you'd have that prior, okay? And then they have knowledge of the FDA's the principles decision rule for drug approval based on data from the clinical trial if it goes to trial. And so you could think like, well, what could I do as a Bayesian? I could say, well, like, oh, I'm the agent. I could generate data from the prior predictive under the clinical trial. And then I could say, oh, I know FDA's decision rule. And I could look at like, well, what's the probability then, predicted probability that FDA approves the drug? I could think about like, oh, what's the cost of the trial? What's the amount of money I make if it gets approved? And then I push that through like incredibly simple mathematics. And then I could like use that to decide whether to put a drug to trial or not. Yeah, so that's the sort of at least toy version of this. And I kind of like the way of thinking, but that was my initial thought. But I think in the pharma industry, there's a lot of issues with this toy version anyway. And it's actually the case that the FDA, the pharma companies is required to report all of their data. And so it was sort of like not actually true, the toy thing. And so like if the pharmaceutical company's developing a drug, they're doing a series of like preclinical testing, and then they do a series of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they have all their lab records and everything. The FDA actually has access to all of that stuff. And so it's not really the case that maybe they have some amount of private information, but I think in reality, it's much more open than was the toy example. And I also think that it's not really in the company's best interest to get an ineffective drug to market. And so like, if the drug was approved, and so I do think it's more of a collaborative effort in this pharma domain between the pharma company and the FDA, because if you have an ineffective drug that goes to market or a drug with bad side effects, then that's going to be bad for the company, and they might end up losing a lot of money on that, particularly in the side effect domain, lawsuits, et cetera. So hence I sort of wonder is, the pharmaceutical company is an example, but is there a way to kind of put in this whole perspective, this much more complexity, and write down an actual contract theory approach where you have actually these kind of layers of complicated data and lots of information that's being put together, and the FDA and pharma company together are like spending a vast amount of time kind of going through that information. So can we kind of put this in this kind of contract theory domain? And also, can we somehow, put the societal benefit in the equation? And so I didn't really like very much this idea of taking a drug to market just entirely based on economics. I find that unappealing. I work a lot with doctors. My brother is the medical director at the Huntsman Cancer Center, and I mentioned the idea to him, and he thought it was appalling. And so to kind of decide whether to take a drug to market just based on this kind of economic equation. So, but I don't mean to be too negative. I think that the whole contract theory thing and this way of thinking is amazing, but can we make it more nuanced and complicated and maybe a little less entirely economic? Maybe there's other aspects to the kind of loss function or decision theory that we're putting in. So in summary, I think this whole paradigm and way of thinking is intriguing. A comment is I super love the music example. My son's a musician, and it's like impossible to make money in the music industry. So that vignette was really cool. I think as a Bayesian community, we should be thinking more about stepping out of our usual box of like, oh, how do we analyze a particular data set, and work more on kind of design problems, decision problems, real world decision making, including in economics and the healthcare industry. And so that's the kind of exciting take-home message of Mike's talk. And I'll just stop there. Yeah, and congratulations again.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks, Mike, for fantastic talk describing a really exciting new approach or really relationship between economics and statistics. And so I'm a biostatistician, a bit like David. I'm going to pick up on maybe kind of take my biostatistical bent on what was discussed and focus a little bit more on, again, like on the examples. And just to say, we had kind of two papers to read. I put the archive versions on the back, so we didn't get the slides, but we had the papers, and I'll focus on that. And it's this really interesting idea in the kind of asymmetry. So Bayesian decision theory, we normally have evidence in terms of a posteriori, have a loss function, we make a decision. Here there's something kind of interesting, which is the information that you're gaining, that you're being given, is, as Mike pointed out, is this kind of two-party approach. And there's this really elegant running example where the principal is the FDA, the agent is the pharmaceutical company, and the FDA has to make a decision on whether to license or not a new intervention. And as can be expected from Mike and others have said, the ideas are really highly original, deeply thought-provoking. I really enjoyed reading the papers, and I highly recommend that you do go on to do that. So just to kind of summarize, in one of the papers, we have this notion of a potential reward, we call that R, that is going to affect an agent's incentive to kind of chance the system. Yeah, the higher the reward, the more you might wish to say, yeah, I'm going to engage with the FDA with an intervention that I don't actually believe is that effective. But, you know, there's a statistical chance that I might get approved, and then I'm going to get a reward. So by running an RCT, a phase 3, even when you suspect to varying degree that the null hypothesis is true. And there was a theorem which Mike had as a ratio, as a ratio of posteriors, and in the paper he kind of rearranges that into this really nice form of a Bayesian FDR, which says if the agent is rational, they're not going to engage under an expectation they're going to lose money. Then you have this inequality that says the probability that the FDR will approve a drug based on the actual null being true is bounded by this tau, which is a test statistic, it's a p-value, and then the reward, the amount of reward that's going to be given over the cost of the trial. So the bigger the reward, the higher the FDR, and therefore you should adjust this kind of threshold that say you want to be more stringent, because if the rewards are higher, we know more people, suppose this room is full of null agents, if I up the reward, more of you are going to engage. The bigger reward, the greater the risk. And so this is a really nice tool for then the FDR to start thinking about. And adjusting this decision boundary to respect this asymmetry is a beautiful aspect of those two papers. very elegant and novel, highly novel solutions that come at this kind of interaction between contract theory. And there are essentially two ways in those two different papers. One is you adjust the stringency of the evidence needed for the FDR because they're aware that they're in an asymmetry situation. So you adjust your p-value threshold or threshold of some test statistic as a function of R. As R goes up, I think what is important to note, which isn't mentioned in the paper, is in the FDA example, as you lower the threshold, the cost also goes up. Yes, if I move my p-value threshold from 0.05 to 0.005, you're going to have to power up your trial. And the way you power up your trial, you can't suggest that the signal is changing, so the only way you can power up your trial is by doing a larger trial. And that's going to induce larger costs. So there is this kind of interaction between the threshold that you put and the cost. And the other point which Mike which highlighted is that to discard p-values in favor of these e-values as a measure of evidence. And these e-values, as he shows in the paper, actually protect against a worst-case scenario. There's a kind of minimax flavor there. But I would question, so the kind of decision theory is that the FDA do have to make a binary decision. They're going to have to approve or not. So that maps onto a kind of hypothesis testing. But something that feels to be lost in there is that the solutions don't take into consideration of the science, the thing that you really care about, which is the treatment effect. And if you want the treatment effect, that comes through a posterior distribution on theta, the true treatment effect, given your data. But the nice thing now is that we actually also want to bring into a fact that there is an incentivization. So the data that we receive is somehow selected or ascertained. And I wonder, I would say, in interactions with the FDA, we really want to ensure that they're also thinking about estimation, the ultimate goal, which is to understand the science. The science doesn't change. It doesn't matter what you do, there is a true treatment effect. That never changes. What changes is the type of information that you get. So from an estimation viewpoint, the kind of idea of agents interacting or not, you preventing me null, you preventing me true, introduces an ascertainment bias on the data that I get. It's somehow censored or truncated. I don't know quite which. I was trying to think about it. Didn't really get to a solution. But that ascertainment mechanism, whereas you kind of block out partial information, introduces a truncation. And we could kind of think about, if we were Bayesian, about doing that. I have some mixture prior on whether you're a null agent or a true agent. Are you acting in good faith or bad faith? And then I've got some information, and so it's not implausible that you could try and get this marginal posterior that takes into account the ascertainment on the data, and then use a decision boundary. So that's one comment. The other comment, which I found slightly unusual, is this reduction of information. So the papers uses a reward R as a single kind of utility value. But that reward function in the context of the clinical trials is going to be a function of both the magnitude of the effect and the market size. Namely, if I have a large effect on a small market, rare disease, major intervention, that's going to give me a financial reward because I can price the drug high. Or it could be a small effect, like a new kind of headache pill on a very large market. That will have a similar reward. And I wondered if there's implications here on both reducing the information in the posterior to a summary statistic, or reducing the utility to a function which is just the market size times the absolute value of the treatment effect, or some scaled version of it. And so I really think that there feels to be that there is an expected reward for an approved null, an expected reward for an approved alternative, and more generally, the actual reward that you would receive as a pharmaceutical company is a function of the science, the actual true value. And in generally speaking, that the reward for an expensive drug with a large effect on a rare disease will be much lower under the null than that for a small effect on a large population, because you're going to get found out. Yeah, if I introduce a new drug for, say, a rare cancer that says this is going to give you a brilliant 10-year survival, you're going to get found out pretty quickly if that actually is a null. And so that was something to bring in. I'll do one slide and then I'll conclude. So the other paper, which is beautiful, is around this use of E-values. Mike didn't really show it, but he shows that they protect against a worst case utility. So in other words, if the FDA is engaging with agents, we don't know, there's an asymmetry here. I don't know whether you're a null agent or a good agent, what your prior is, that the use of E-values protects you against that. And that minimax or maxi-min solutions are the kind of ultimate safety net. And just a historical note here, Jimmy Savage originally worked on trying to prove a unifying theory of decision theory using Wald's minimax, discarded it in favor of Bayesian maximum expected utility. And then obviously Morgenstern and others. But minimax decision theory is very conservative. And it protects against the most extreme scenario. And I'm just worried that it will spook the market. Yeah, if the FDA moves towards a position of ultimate safety, we want to incentivize good actors to engage. And so I think there's something there we want to incentivize the good, we want to protect from the bad. And just a kind of another, basic, I guess, an aside, there are some interesting connections here with robust Bayes, which was a very hot topic back in the kind of 80s. And it has a similar flavor. Actually, robust Bayes was a strong connection between work happening in economics and work happening in the Bayesian statistics community. I have a paper on this, which in 2016, Statistical Science, where we review this. And in robust decision theory, the consideration is away from minimax is seen as too conservative, but this notion of a reasonably worst case scenario. This is how governments often make decisions. It's like, we don't want to really against the extreme, we want to protect ourselves against the kind of reasonably worst case. And in that paper we have is a commentary both from people from the robust Bayes, but also people like Lars Hansen, the Nobel laureate, comments on this. And there's this whole area of like reasonably worst case. And it actually goes back to robust control theory, Peter Whittle in the 80s. And in there, in robust control theory, you're trying to guide a system, but you think nature's being malevolent. It's trying to buffer you in a bad way, but not too bad a way. And I think there's some interesting things there. So just to conclude, this is this really exciting new era, the kind of idea of the interaction between contract and theory and statistics. And I would really highly recommend you read the paper. I think this idea, this blend of decision theory and asymmetry of incentives is deeply thought-provoking. I would say on the applied example, which provides new decision rules, I wouldn't want to see that decouple from the ultimate objective, which is trying to understand the science. What is the truth? That's what we seek as statisticians. What is the truth? The truth is that there is a treatment effect. FDA want to understand that. And so I think a blend of that with kind of accurate Bayesian inference and estimation. And the final thing is to say we want to want to produce new interventions to market safely, but we want to kind of incentivize good actors in this position. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to the two discussants. Maybe you can spend maybe 3 minutes to respond to that, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for audience questions as well.
No, I don't need slides. I'll try to be less than 3, so there can be some audience questions. That'd be great. So thanks for the commentary. Lucid as not unexpected from these two individuals. I find it interesting that I've been giving talks for like 40 years on things like posteriors and algorithms and all that, and to all kinds of audiences, and they're never outraged in any way by anything I say. I've been giving now talks for the last 5 years where I say the word markets or economics and everyone gets outraged. It's kind of funny. And so I'm totally sensitive to what David said about, so the FDA example is in a bit of a cartoon. We are pursuing to complexify it, and I hope that others will take that on. But if you don't take some part of an economic story where there's some hidden information and there's a strategic agent, then they will act strategically despite what your best effort is, okay? Yes, it is more cooperative than a naive game theoretic, classical competitive game would suggest. I wouldn't want to say that. In fact, game theory is really not just competitive game theory. It's not just cooperative. It's a whole blend. And serious game theorists have a very complexified view of actual games, like serious auctions that go on for months and so on. So, but at the end of the day, these pharmaceutical companies, yes, some of their data is revealed and all, but there were discussions over the, outside. There was how much investment should we do in this or that? What kind of flow should we have? What kind of protein should we be looking at and all that? And in all those informal discussions, there are incentives. It's a business. And so if you don't start to say, well, I recognize that, and therefore I'm going to set up my contract to reflect that, they will cheat, they will steal, they will lie. That's what humans do, and it's not because they're unethical. Okay? It's because they're just trying to figure out what the best to do from the point of view of making a company that works. Yes, and now there is a truth, and we're all trying to get the truth, but I would be a little bit cautious about saying that's the main goal of the FDA. And it's the main goal of the system. The main goal is to get things out there that actually make human life better. And there is a treatment effect notion, right? But really, at the end of the day, they're going to get some hypotheses, some proteins from some companies, right? And they simply, in the bag of things that come out, they want to make some good decisions. Okay, so it's less about estimation to me of the treatment effect and the science, and more about making good decisions in a very complicated system that has got all kinds of players in it and all kinds of strategic considerations. So I don't want to just reduce this to economics. That would be wrong. But you need to add some economics. Otherwise, you're effectively having some implicit economics behind the scenes that you have no control over and will be operative. And so I don't want to blind myself. And so I've had more trouble actually in the machine learning audience. They just sort of say, well, our predictive big machines will do all of the work. What's this all this economic nonsense? And so then they allow the implicit strategic agents to have their way. And that's why you see all this discussion of fairness and about, the data sets are being manipulated and all these things that, machine learning is broken because X, Y, and Z. Most of them is because they didn't think through the full incentive theoretic system. Okay. Second comment, quickly, is that there really is an opportunity here for Bayes. If you look at these books, they use the word Bayes a lot, but it's always about there's just some prior distribution sitting there. And all of the quantities, the decisions are calculated relative to that prior. They never have Bayesian updates into a posterior. They never have data. They never have the full range of the considerations of Bayesian inference, okay, which is kind of shocking, but that's just kind of how it arose originally. And because there's some hidden variable, and if you don't know it, you average over it. And so there is just, whether you like my framework exactly or not, there really is a very clear role of saying, I'm going to look at all that stuff and all their equations, and I'm not going to just do one shot, take an average, and make a decision. I'm going to evolve it in a Bayesian way, and I'm going to do contract theory in an ongoing Bayesian way. You could do it in your own way, in a different way. But there is a huge opportunity. I just want to emphasize how important that opportunity sits there. When you see Bayes in those books, they do not mean our kind of Bayes. They mean there's just an average over a prior. And there's a huge opportunity to make it into realistic data analysis meets all these economic considerations. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take a little bit of time for audience questions. We have some microphones here. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand.
Thank you. It was a very interesting lecture. I have a PhD in economics and contract theory. That's why I a bit know the topics. My question is, this was partly mentioned also by the discussants, how to go here more nuanced. You know surely that in principle agent theory you have two basic situations of incomplete asymmetric information, moral hazard, and adverse selection. And you mentioned in your example that you expect that I think the agent would take the trial. What if not? So is this applicable both to screening, to signaling, to all different nuanced situations in contract theory? What to do here in terms of patient priors and in terms of learning? Thanks.
I want to just turn that back to the audience. So, I could teach a whole class on that. There's many areas in game theory, economic mechanism design, including information design, where Dirk Bergman have contributed. There's many, many forms of like insurance markets where you're making a decision, but you're a little bit worried about worst case, so you make sure that someone else comes in and kind of covers you in that case. It's a very, very rich set of topics. And I, in some sense, yes, I kind of decided I'd go ahead and give examples that I knew were a little cartoonish. But really, I want to emphasize that, those folks are just proceeding along their way, having a major impact on science and on government and regulation. And some of them know some statistics, but it's very limited, p-value econometric statistics. And so, yes, you can elaborate all the stories I talked about here. There can be multi-stage versions of this. There can be some signaling going on. There can be, strategic signaling. There can be information gathering in groups where I want someone to incentivize people to take the exploration burden. If everybody just exploits, then no one explores. All kinds of group theoretic things that are just partially addressed by a few smart people in that literature. And so, yeah, we can and should elaborate everything here. I just want to kind of, especially for the young people in the room, say, folks, we just haven't been working on this stuff at all unless you maybe had an economics class at the Bocconi and you realize that you should also do this. But, I just feel I just have this passion for we're missing the boat, and therefore all the AI people are taking over. I gave this same kind of talk 15 or 20 years ago. I said, data analysis, that's going to all be done by the computer scientists. We got to, do optimization. We got to do it large scale. We got to do, and that's sort of, was mitigated over time. But I think it's even worse here because these folks are naive about the economics, so we can be less naive.
Maybe one more question. Any other questions?
There's this gentleman in the blue in the front.
Wonderful, Mike, wonderful.
You always say that. Not just to me, but to everybody.
Okay, so one thing that drives me crazy about regulation is often targeting identifiable costs, but ignoring the unidentifiable benefits that come out from that. And your work on your stuff about the privacy, that's terrific, because all of a sudden you're saying, hey, what about the other people? But I think one of the big dangers the world is facing right now is the tariff situation. Have you brought some of your stuff to bear on the tariff issue?
No, I'm not a macroeconomics person. I'm doing micro, and tariffs are macro level. But you can pick up any econ book and you learn that pretty quickly that tariffs are a bad idea. But a lot of these things are not just kind of, so a lot of those ideas come in these markets which are not asymmetry. They're symmetric things. A lot of the economic concepts we know about, that this doesn't work, this doesn't work, it's because it's all symmetric. These players coming out, there's Nash equilibria. And another kind of more technical part of my talk is that equilibria of Stackelberg kind. And in fact, I think Chris was kind of getting at that. You make a decision, someone else makes a decision, you think about that a little bit, that kind of equilibrium. It's more familiar to Blackwell. It's more familiar, I think, probably even to Finetti. And so I think instead of just kind of thinking about, let's help the macroeconomists to make better decisions about nations and all that, I really want to design mechanisms that allow us to kind of proceed through life when there's people we want to work with, to know more or less, and we want to cooperate partly with them, but we can't reveal everything. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's thank all the speakers again. And I think there's a break now until 11, and then we'll have another keynote here in this room. Thanks.